The stench of failure hung heavy in the stagnation of the cabin, a cloying, sweet rot scent that clung to the fabric of Maylin's dress and settled into the pores of her skin. It was the smell of 300 pounds of prime beef, intended to sustain them through the coming winter, now surrendering to the relentless, unseasonal heat of late October. Maylin stood over the salting table, her face an unreadable mask of calm, though her knuckles were white as she gripped the edge of the wood. The flies were the only ones celebrating. Their droning buzz filled the silence of the room, a mocking choir preaching the gospel of waste. She did not weep. Tears would not reverse the chemical breakdown of the proteins, nor would they reimburse the silver dollars she had paid the drovers 2 days prior. She simply picked up the boning knife, the blade worn thin from years of sharpening, and began the grim task of separating the salvageable from the ruined, though she knew the ratio was catastrophic. Her daughter Kai sat in the corner on a stool too high for her legs, swinging her feet in a slow, rhythmic pendulum. The 6-year-old watched her mother with dark, intelligent eyes, sensing the tension in the room, but understanding enough of their hard life to remain silent. Kai held a piece of dried cornbread, chewing slowly, making it last. The silence stretched, measured only by the wet sound of meat hitting the slop bucket, a sound that represented meals they would not eat and security they would not have. Maylin's mind, however, was not dwelling on the loss, but dissecting the cause. The root cellar was too shallow. The ambient temperature of the earth at 4 feet was still subject to the whims of the sun baking the dust above. She needed depth. She needed the cold consistency that she remembered from her grandfather's distinct method of preservation in the old country, a method that relied on the stabilizing thermal mass of the earth itself, far below where the frost or the heat could reach. She wiped her hands on her apron, the decision crystallizing in her mind like the salt she had wasted on the spoilage. The surface world was volatile and cruel, but the underground was constant. Maylin walked to the heavy ledger book on the mantel, opening it to the page where she tracked their dwindling finances. The ink was fading, but the math was merciless. She had enough coin for materials or food, but not both. If she bought food now, they would starve by February when the prices spiked. If she built what she saw in her mind's eye, she could buy cheap, tough cuts now, cure them to perfection, and sell them back to the ranchers when the snows closed the pass. It was a gamble on her own competence. She looked at Kai, who had stopped swinging her legs. "Mama?" Kai asked, her voice small. "We are going to dig," Maylin said, her voice devoid of tremor. "We are going to build a place where the heat cannot steal from us." She closed the ledger with a soft thud. It was not a question of if she could do it. Necessity had removed the luxury of doubt. The morning sun crested the jagged ridge of the eastern hills, casting long, bruised shadows across the scrub brush and hard-packed dirt of Maylin's property. She had been awake since before the dawn, marking out a rectangular perimeter with lengths of twine and wooden stakes she had whittled the night before. The geometry had to be precise. A collapse was not an option. She measured a space 12 feet by 8 feet, located on the north side of a small rise where the soil would be naturally cooler. She checked the angles with a makeshift square, ensuring the corners were true. It was essential that the load-bearing walls she intended to build would sit on a perfectly level foundation, and that started with the very first cut into the sod. As she drove the point of her heavy spade into the earth, the sound of hoofbeats approached from the main road. She did not look up, her boot driving the metal deep into the resistance of the clay. The rider slowed, the leather of his saddle creaking. It was Harrow, a cattleman who owned the sprawling acreage to the south. He sat high on his horse, a man whose skepticism was worn as openly as his hat. He watched her for a long moment, his gaze taking in the small woman, the child gathering rocks, and the ambitious outline of the string. "Digging a grave, Mrs. Lynn?" Harrow asked, his voice rough with a mockery that masqueraded as neighborly concern. Bit big for a dog, bit small for a horse. Mei Lin levered a heavy clod of earth up, turning it over onto the pile. She paused, resting her hands on the handle of the shovel, and looked up at him. The sun caught the sharp angles of her face, illuminating the sweat already gathering at her hairline. "A larder, Mr. Harrow," she replied, her tone flat and polite. "For the curing." Harrow laughed, a dry, barking sound that startled a crow from the fence line. "Underground? In this clay? You'll have a mud pit come spring rains, or a cave-in before Christmas. Woodsheds are for smoking, Mrs. Lynn. That's how it's done here." "Wood burns, wood rots, and wood is hot," she said, returning her foot to the shovel. "The earth is constant." Another rider approached, slower this time. It was Thomas, a man of few words who ran a small timber operation near the creek. He didn't laugh. He reined his horse in a few yards behind Harrow, his eyes scanning the precise lines of the twine. He saw the logic in the layout that Harrow missed. He saw the pile of stones Kai was organizing by size, and the methodical way Mei Lin was stripping the topsoil to save for the roof. He tipped his hat, not to Harrow, but to the widow. "The clay is hard past 3 feet," Thomas said quietly. "You'll need a pick, not just that spade." "I have a pick," Mei Lin said, not stopping her rhythm. "Dig, lift, turn." "I'll leave a sharpened iron bar by the gate on my way back," Thomas added, ignoring Harrow's incredulous snort. "For the leverage." Mei Lin nodded once, a microscopic acknowledgment of the debt she was incurring. She did not watch them right away. She had moved 3 cubic feet of earth. She had hundreds left to go. By the 4th day, the excavation had become a war of attrition between the woman and the geology of the territory. The hole was now waist deep, a gaping wound in the landscape that smelled of damp, ancient soil and iron. Mei Lin's hands were a landscape of their own, blistered, calloused, and stained a permanent reddish brown. Every muscle in her back screamed in protest with each swing of the pickaxe Thomas had lent her, but she compartmentalized the pain, treating it as a separate entity from her will. The rhythm was hypnotic. Strike, loosen, shovel, throw. Kai sat at the edge of the pit, her small legs dangling over the precipice. She was the timekeeper, the water-bearer, and the student. "Why does it have to be so deep?" Kai asked, peering down into the gloom where her mother stood. The air down there was already noticeably different, stiller, cooler, stripped of the dry heat that scorched the surface. Mei Lin paused, leaning on the pickaxe to wipe her brow with a rag that was no longer white. She gestured to the wall of earth beside her. "Put your hand here, Kai, against the dirt." The girl leaned down, pressing her small palm against the dark, compacted soil. Her eyes widened. "It's cold, like the creek water." "Heat rises," Mei Lin explained, her breath coming in measured pulls, "and the ground remembers the winter if you go deep enough. We are building a box to hold the winter. If we build it on top," she pointed to the blazing sun above, "the sun wins. Down here, the earth protects. It is about stability, Kai. Meat spoils when the temperature changes too much. We need it to stay the same." The deeper they went, the harder the work became. The soil transitioned from the manageable topsoil to a dense, stubborn hardpan that shattered like low-grade pottery rather than scooping away. Mei Lin had to swing the pick with her full body weight, shivering the shock up her skeletal structure with every impact. She created a ramp on one side to wheel the debris out, a crude, inclined plane that required immense effort to navigate with a loaded barrow. Thomas had passed by twice more in the last few days. He never stayed long, knowing that a woman like Mei Lin would view pity as an insult, but he would pause to observe the structural integrity of her cut. He noticed she was tapering the wall slightly outward toward the top, a batter angle, to prevent the soil from collapsing inward under its own weight. It was an engineering principle most men in the valley didn't understand, yet she executed it by instinct and heritage. "You're hitting the shale layer soon," Thomas called down one evening as the light began to fail, casting the pit into deep shadow. "I know," Maylin's voice echoed from the hole. "It'll make a good floor, self-draining." Thomas smiled to himself, a rare expression. He appreciated the competence more than the beauty, though he was beginning to see that too. "Don't work past dark, Maylin. The shadows hide the snakes." "The snakes like the warmth," she replied. "It's too cold for them down here." With the excavation complete, a rectangle of void 6 feet deep into the crust of the plains, the construction phase began. This was where the financial stakes threatened to strangle the project before it could breathe. Maylin needed stone. Not just any stone, but flat, stable shale or limestone that could be stacked with minimal mortar. Buying quarried stone from the town mason was impossible. The cost would have consumed her entire budget for the salt and sugar needed for the cure. Instead, she turned to the riverbed 3 miles away. For 3 days, she and Kai took the mule and the cart, making agonizingly slow trips back and forth. They scavenged river rocks, looking for those with at least 2 flat faces. It was back-breaking labor, lifting the heavy, water-smooth stones, judging their weight, and hauling them to the site. The walls had to be lined. Raw earth would eventually crumble or harbor burrowing insects. Maylin mixed the mortar herself, a slurry of lime, sand, and water. She couldn't afford enough lime for a full bed, so she used a dry stack method for the bulk of the wall, using the mortar only to seal the gaps and cap the top layers. She taught Kai how to select the chinking stones, small, wedge-shaped pebbles used to stabilize the larger rocks from behind. "It is a puzzle," Maylin told her daughter, handing her a jagged piece of slate. "Every stone has a place where it wants to rest. If you force it, the wall will be angry. It will fall. You must listen to the stone." Kai took the instructions seriously, her small fingers probing the gaps, finding the perfect wedge to stop a 50-pound boulder from rocking. They worked in tandem, the silence between them filled only by the scrape of stone on stone and the wet slap of the trowel. The challenge came with the lintels, the heavy stones needed to frame the door at the base of the ramp. They were too heavy for Maylin to lift alone. She had rigged a tripod of logs and a pulley system, a block and tackle she had salvaged from the barn, but the friction was fighting her. She pulled on the rope, her boots sliding in the dust, the massive stone hovering just inches off the ground, refusing to rise further. The rope bit into her palms, threatening to tear the skin. She gritted her teeth, refusing to let go, locked in a stalemate with gravity. Suddenly, a large gloved hand grasped the rope above hers. The weight vanished. "On 3, Thomas said, his voice right beside her ear. He smelled of pine sawdust and tobacco. Maylin didn't waste breath on protest. 1, 2, 3. Together, they hauled the line. The stone rose smoothly, swinging into place above the doorframe. Thomas held the line taut while Maylin guided the rock onto the mortar bed, checking the level instantly. "Secure," she said. Thomas released the tension. He stepped back, rubbing his shoulder. He looked at the walls, now chest-high, rising from the floor of the pit. They were straight, true, and built to last 100 years. "You build better than the mason," Thomas said, inspecting a tight joint. "The mason builds for money," Maylin said, wiping a smear of gray mortar from her cheek. "I build for survival. The motivation is different." "I have some seasoned oak beams at the mill," Thomas said, looking at the open sky above the pit. "Too short for a barn, too knotty for furniture. They'd rot if I left them out. You'd be doing me a favor taking them off my lot." Maylin looked at him. She knew it wasn't true. Oak was always valuable, but she also knew he wasn't offering charity. He was offering a partnership of sorts, an investment in the success of the impossible. "I can pay you in cured ham." "In February," she said. Thomas met her eyes. "February is fine." The roof was the most critical component of the engineering. It could not simply be a lid. It had to be a lung. The structure needed to hold the weight of the earth that would be piled back on top for insulation, but it also needed to facilitate the complex physics of the smoke. Mei Lin used the oak beams Thomas had delivered, setting them close together across the stone walls. Over the beams, she laid a distinct pattern of smaller branches, then a layer of straw, and finally the heavy clay soil she had excavated weeks ago. But before the earth was packed down, she constructed the heart of the machine, the ventilation system. At the rear of the chamber, she built a chimney from hollow clay pipes, sealing the joints with high-heat clay she had found by the creek. This was the exhaust. At the front, near the door, she built the intake, a low channel that would draw fresh air in. The principle was simple thermodynamics. The firebox, located in a separate, smaller pit outside the main chamber, would generate smoke and heat. The smoke would be piped into the room, cooling as it traveled through a subterranean flue. It would fill the chamber, curing the hanging meat, and the warmer, spent air would rise and exit through the rear chimney, creating a constant, gentle draft. If the draft was too fast, the meat would dry out. If it was too slow, the meat would sour. Kai watched as her mother adjusted the damper on the external firebox. It was a delicate mechanism made from a flat piece of tin. "It has to breathe, Kai," Mei Lin explained, her hands black with soot. "Like you, in and out." She lit a small pile of kindling in the firebox. It was the first test. She didn't use the hickory wood yet. She just used dry twigs to test the airflow. They hurried down the ramp and into the dark, stone-lined room. It was cool, the air smelling of damp earth and drying lime. Mei Lin held a lantern up to the ceiling. For a moment, nothing happened. The air was still. Mei Lin held her breath, the anxiety tightening her chest. Had she miscalculated the height of the chimney? Was the intake too small? Then a wisp of white smoke curled out of the intake vent near the floor. It didn't rush. It drifted, lazy and thick. It pooled along the floor for a second before the draft caught it, pulling it gently upward, swirling around the oak beams where the hooks would soon hang, and then vanishing up the rear exhaust. The airflow was perfect. It was a slow, controlled river of air. "It works," Kai whispered, sensing the victory. Mei Lin lowered the lantern, the light casting long shadows against the stone walls that were now her fortress against the winter. She allowed herself a small, brief smile. The structure was sound. The physics held true, but the true test was yet to come. They had the machine, but they still needed the fuel and the meat. And the town was still laughing. She could hear the echoes of it when she went to the general store. The whispers about the widow's folly, the dirt hole. Let them laugh. The February snows would silence them all. With the physical vessel constructed, the focus shifted to the chemistry of preservation. Mei Lin took the last of her silver, coins she had been saving in a hollowed-out Bible, and went to the slaughterhouse on the edge of town. The butcher, a large man with forearms stained perpetually pink, looked at her with a mixture of pity and confusion when she pointed not to the prime loins or the tender rib steaks, but to the rough, unwanted cuts. She bought shoulders, shanks, and briskets, the muscles that had done the work, the tough, sinewy fibers that required patience to unlock. She also purchased 3 whole hogs that had been deemed too small for the main market. To the town, she was buying garbage. To Mei Lin, she was buying potential. She hired a cart to transport the load, the wet carcasses piled high, covered in canvas to shield them from the flies that were already thinning out as the autumn chill began to sharpen the air. Back at the cabin, the kitchen became a laboratory. The table was scrubbed with vinegar until the wood bleached white. Mei Lin measured her cure with the precision of an apothecary. This was not a matter of guessing. Too little salt and the meat would rot from the inside out, a condition the old-timers called bone taint. Too much, and it would be inedible leather. She mixed coarse sea salt, brown cane sugar, and a small, dangerous pinch of saltpeter to maintain the pink hue of the flesh. She added cracked black pepper and crushed red chilies she had grown in her garden, creating a mound of granular spice that smelled sharp and earthy. Kai stood on a crate, her small hands washed raw, helping to rub the mixture into the meat. They worked the cure into every crevice, around every bone, massaging the muscle until the friction warmed their palms. It was an intimate, violent act of preparation. They stacked the meat in the large oak barrels Thomas had provided, layering flesh and salt, weighing the top down with scrubbed river stones to force the moisture out and draw the brine in. For 2 weeks the meat slept in the salt. Maylin turned the pieces every 3 days, her hands stinging from the brine, checking the texture. She was waiting for the firmness that signaled the cure had penetrated to the center. It was a silent, anxious vigil, governed by the slow osmosis of survival. When the curing phase ended, the smoking began. This was the heartbeat of the operation, a process that demanded a sleepless devotion. Maylin moved the cured hams and briskets into the underground chamber, hanging them from the oak beams on iron hooks she had bent into shape herself. The room was already holding its temperature, a cool, steady 50 degrees despite the fluctuating weather outside. She lit the fire in the external firebox, using the hickory and applewood logs Thomas had delivered weeks ago. She did not want a flame, she wanted a coal bed. A flame created heat, and heat cooked the meat too fast, rendering the fat. She needed cold smoke. She dampened the wood chips, choking the oxygen supply just enough to produce a thin blue stream of smoke that flowed like water through the intake pipe. For the next 20 days, Maylin became a ghost in her own life. She could not leave the firebox for more than 4 hours. If the fire died, the process paused. If it flared, the meat ruined. She slept in shifts, waking before the rooster, walking out into the dark in her heavy wool shawl to feed the smoldering maw of the furnace. Kai took the daylight watches, sitting by the firebox with her primer book, adding a single log every hour, exactly as her mother taught her. The smell of the smoke began to permeate everything. It was in their hair, their clothes, the very timber of their cabin. It drifted down the valley, a savory, complex aroma that confused the neighbors. It didn't smell like the acrid, burnt burning of a brush pile. It smelled like hunger and promise. Harrow, riding his fence line a mile away, would stop his horse and sniff the wind, frowning. He couldn't understand how the widow was burning so much wood without burning down her house, nor could he identify the sweet, rich scent that seemed to rise from the very ground itself. Down in the chamber, the air was a thick, fragrant fog. Maylin would enter only briefly to check the color of the meat, her lantern cutting a beam through the haze. The hams were turning a deep, burnished mahogany, the fat cap taking on a golden, translucent sheen. They were transforming, hardening, becoming something imperishable. Then came the hammer blow of winter. February did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with a scream. A blizzard swept down from the northern peaks, a white wall of fury that buried the valley under 3 feet of snow in 24 hours. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the shingles of the cabin and driving snow through the cracks in the walls. Maylin and Kai huddled near the cast-iron stove in the main house, burning their firewood supply at an alarming rate just to keep the water in the bucket from freezing solid. Outside, the world had stopped. The roads were impassable. The cattle on Harrow's ranch were huddled in ravines, freezing to death where they stood, their breath icing over their muzzles. But Maylin's mind was underground. She wrapped herself in layers of wool and tied a rope around her waist, securing the other end of the porch post so she wouldn't get lost in the whiteout conditions of the yard. She fought her way through the drifts to the meat house. The external firebox was buried, but the heat of the coals had melted a small crater in the snow, keeping the air intake clear. She dug it out, her hands numb, and checked the draft. It was still pulling. She descended the ramp, clearing the snow from the door. Inside, the silence was absolute. She lit her lantern and looked at the thermometer she had hung on the wall. 45 degrees. The earth was holding. While the surface world was freezing enough to shatter steel, the thermal mass of the deep soil, combined with the faint residual warmth of the smoke draft, kept the chamber in a perfect state of suspension. The meat was safe. In fact, the cold snap was beneficial. It helped to firm the fat even further. She sat there for a moment in the dark, warm womb of the earth, listening to the muffled roar of the wind above, feeling a profound sense of validation. The storm was a killer, but she had built a fortress that death could not enter. The thaw came 2 weeks later, the sun finally breaking the gray stranglehold of the clouds. The snow melted into slush, turning the roads to rivers of mud, but the air was crisp and clear. It was Valentine's Day, though Mei Lin marked the date not for romance, but for the maturation of the cure. The waiting was over. She walked to the meat house, no longer trudging through snow, but stepping firmly on the wet earth. Thomas rode up just as she was opening the heavy wooden door. He looked tired. The winter had been hard on the timber crews, and he had lost weight. He dismounted without a word, watching as she disappeared into the dark. She emerged a moment later, carrying a whole cured ham on her shoulder. It was heavy, dense, and smelled of hickory, thyme, and victory. She set it on the salting table which she had brought outside into the sunlight. The meat was dark, almost black on the outside, crusted with the spices and the smoke. With a sharp knife she sliced into the center. The blade slid through the meat with a resistance that spoke of density, not toughness. The slice fell away, a perfect, jewel-toned ruby red, framed by creamy white fat. The smell hit them instantly, savory and sweet. Mei Lin cut a small sliver and handed it to Thomas. He took it, his gloved fingers brushing hers, a contact that lingered a fraction of a second longer than necessary. He ate it slowly, closing his eyes. The salt was balanced by the sugar, the smoke was a whisper rather than a shout, and the texture was like velvet. "It's the best thing I've ever tasted," Thomas said, his voice quiet and serious. He looked at her, seeing not just the widow, but the architect. "You did it, Mei Lin. You beat the winter." "We beat it," she corrected softly, nodding toward the oak beams he had given her. "The wood held." "The wood is just wood," Thomas said. "The design was yours." He looked at the open door of the cellar, then back to her. "I'll take my payment now, if the offer stands, but I'd like to buy 10 more, for the crew." The validation of the community did not come with applause. It came with silver. Word spread from Thomas to the general store, and from the store to the ranches. The widow's meat became a commodity more valuable than gold dust in a season where fresh game was scarce and winter stores were rotting in damp cellars. Harrow was the last to come. He arrived in his wagon, his face pinched from the financial losses of the freeze. He walked up the path, past the spot where he had laughed at the string layout months ago. He stood before Mei Lin, who was busy wrapping a brisket in brown butcher paper. He didn't apologize. Men like Harrow didn't know how. But he took off his hat, wringing the brim in his hands. "My cellar flooded," Harrow said, staring at his boots. "Lost the potatoes. Lost the salt pork." Mei Lin didn't gloat. She didn't remind him of the mud pit comment. She simply finished tying the string around the package. "The earth is tricky, Mr. Harrow. You have to ask it nicely." "I need food for the hands," he said, looking up. "I can pay market price." "The price has gone up," Mei Lin said calmly, handing the package to Kai to stack. "But I will sell to you." Harrow nodded, accepting the penalty as fair. He bought 50 pounds of meat, paying with heavy silver dollars that clinked into Mei Lin's tin box. The sound of security, of shoes for Kai, of seeds for the spring. Years later, the cabin would eventually fall to ruin, the wood reclaiming the structure. But the meat house remained. The stone walls, backed by the pressure of the earth and the genius of the tapered angle, refused to collapse. The heavy oak beams, cured by decades of smoke, hardened into iron-like solidity. It stood as a scar on the hillside, a testament to a winter where a woman refused to let the cold win. It was no longer just a larder. It was a monument to competence. And in the town records, the name May Lynn was not listed under charity cases or widows, but under merchants. She had dug a hole in the ground and filled it with survival, proving that while the world above burns and freezes, the truth, like the earth, remains constant.